This is the Miller philosopher. Feanor is well known as being the most gifted, and depending on who you talk to, most villainized elf of all of the Noldor and any of the High Elves. In an earlier video, a couple of them actually, I suggested that a larger reason for this may have been the death of his mother, Miriel, which sent his father into a deep depression for a long time, whatever that counts as for elves anyway, and caused the eventual rift between the royal family of the clan when he eventually remarried. Now, the Silmarillion says that some thought that it may have been better if Finwë had never remarried in the first place because of all the issues that event caused. But for this video, I'm going to take that a step further. What if Míriel had chosen not to die and somehow lived? Of course, the most obvious answer being that the entire step family of Feanor, with the exception of his mother-in-law of course, would never have existed in the first place. But I also think there's more to it than that, with more ramifications than people might realize. So, first, I think that Finwë, Feanor's father, would have been an entirely different person than he was canonically speaking. As I said, he wasn't the same elf after Míriel died and was deeply depressed. And afterward, it's said that all his love went to their son, and even when he remarried, the lion's share of that affection always defaulted to Feanor. However, I think Finwë may have been more firmer with Feanor if Míriel had lived. Reason being that Finwë was one of the very few people Feanor actually respected, and the only one of two people that he was consistently loyal to, even subservient, because he never once tried to oust his father as High King, despite his reputation among the elves, and fans alike actually, that he was an extremely ambitious person. Therefore, a Finwë who was much more willing to lay down hard boundaries without the baggage of being reminded of his dead wife, I think would have very much curtailed Feanor's ambitions. That said, it may have also led to the Silmarils never being made in the first place because they were a product of Feanor's ambitions. Remember that Feanor was ever trying to create newer and newer things, because that was also part of his ambition. So, if that ambition to create is curtailed, then a desire to create something as magnificent as the Silmarils may never have come into being, and thereby, no Silmarils. I also think Míriel herself would have been able to pass on a more even temperament to Feanor as well, as Feanor, I believe, was extremely loyal to her canon-wise, since the Silmarillion also says that he chose his name based on his mother. And Míriel and Finwë were both ambitious as well in terms of what they wanted to achieve in Valinor with a large family. Hence, you can see where Feanor gets his ambition from. But were never malicious or jealous about it. There was no sense of self-entitlement or self-grandeur, if you could say. If she survived, she may have taught this to Feanor, that aspect that they both shared, as Finwë post-Míriel was no longer an ambitious person, and therefore there was no one to teach Feanor how to temper it, at least that he respected anyway, since the closest he ever came to that was his wife, Nerdinel, but that was only for a time. So, an ambitious royal family without the baggage of loss and imbalance probably would have made Valinor an even more beautiful place than it already was, but potentially without the Silmarils, so perhaps not as beautiful, I guess. But neither would there have been any potential for internal strife and division to be manipulated by others either. Which, if you think about it, is a creepy thought, that the Silmarils, the greatest creations in the Silmarillion, or in Valinor, and arguably all of Middle-earth, were actually born from pain and loss. That said, though, what about the larger politics of Valinor, specifically Melkor? I don't see much changing there in terms of attitude. He still would have been a jealous and malicious asshole plotting to take down Valinor from within after his pardon. That particular ambition, I guess you can say, had little to nothing to do actually with the Noldor Elves or with Feanor in particular. They were just tools and part of that plan. So, my guess would be that, based on one of his few actions that did not revolve around the Noldor, I guess, the alliance with Ungoliant to take down the two trees, that still would have happened. But it would have taken much longer to happen, because now there's no Noldor to deceive, and that Feanor, in this timeline, as much as he's driven, is no longer furious and almost kind of half mad, and I guess you can say. He would have been much more balanced, but no less gifted. So therefore, I think he would have been less vulnerable to Melkor's lies and whatnot. And I think the same would apply to Miriel and Finwë as well. Otherwise, everything else would play out as it does canon-wise, from the death of the trees to Melkor's alliance with Ungoliant and his departure from Valinor into Middle-earth. But that being said, I think this is where the real damage is going to happen. You see, without any jewels, or lack thereof, Valinor pretty much is more or less screwed after the death of the trees. That is, that there is no light to be saved from the original light of those two trees, and therefore there isn't really any kind of hope, I guess you can say, in that land after that. Everything would more or less be kind of depressed and kind of down, even though it still would have been a holy land, I guess you can say, and probably still lighted by the sun and the moon if they were indeed passing over that area during the First and Second Ages. But again, there would be absolutely no hope in terms of any remembrance of the glory that had been before. Ungoliant would still turn on Melkor. That was just part of her nature. And he would still arrive and wage war against the Sindar Elves that were already in Middle-earth. However, there would be no Noldor to arrive to help them either. Feanor isn't the hot-tempered elf lord mad with grief over the murder of his father and scarred by bad relationships at this point. So therefore, he has no drive to leave Valinor and take half the Noldor with him, basically, and to set up and start waging war in Beleriand. That doesn't happen here. Also, too, and I guess if you want to call this a major point or not, no Feanor, no Morgoth. Just saying. Now, what this means is that the Morroquindi in Beleriand would essentially be overrun, with Doriath being the only isolated holdout that existed. An island of hope amongst a sea of destruction. And here I'm not sure quite what would happen, because I'm not sure if the Valar would still send a relief force much later than sooner, that they do in the main timeline, or if they perhaps send one out quicker, or perhaps even not at all. So I think I'm going to say much later at this point, as they would have been, I think, compelled by Uru to do something, because, you know, humanity still has to come into the world, and they would have almost zero chance now of being free in any way, shape, or form, because now Melkor can pretty much run roughshod all over Middle-earth, rather than just a tiny corner of it. And also, too, perhaps their conscience might have motivated them to do something as well, because they have been slacking too long, given that seems to be a pattern with them. But essentially, you would still get a war of wrath with all the High Elves, but this time, the Noldor would be much more enforced like the Valinor. But also, too, though, I think they would have to liberate more than just Beleriand as well, as without a siege to box in Melkor to northwest of Middle-earth, as I said before, you pretty much can focus on taking over the rest of Middle-earth in force, while the Valar weren't doing anything at all for a long time. Now, that being said, dwarves would still be a major problem because they're fucking dwarves. But at the same time, Melkor never paid much attention to them in the main timeline. And if he does what Sauron did in Second Age, he could just defeat them and just leave them in their mountain strongholds. But even that would be a tough prospect because, again, they're fucking dwarves. They are literally built to resist anything like Morgoth and Sauron. And even if you beat them, they're going to take a whole bunch of your forces along with him. That being said, though, It's also hard to say if Morgoth actually had the ability to just leave them alone, given his massive and malicious ego to control absolutely everything that had a will of its own, essentially. It's arguable that he would not have been able to leave them alone and would have tried to concoct, some way to go into the mountain strongholds and take them over. But that being said, the War of Wrath would take much longer and be much more grueling because of all the time that the Valar took to actually initiate the war, which would be longer, I think, in this particular timeline. And given that Beleriand was sunk somehow in the main timeline, arguably much more of Middle-earth would be sunk or destroyed in this fan fiction that I'm concocting right now. And there would be no Numenor as well, so the Second Age and Third Age would look vastly different. But otherwise, this is what I think may happen if Miriel had not died in Valinor and remained with her family and her people. And to be honest, this is actually kind of a scary thought, because it's very much like the one OG Star Trek episode, The City on the Edge of Forever, where Captain Kirk goes back in time through a portal and saves a seemingly unknown random woman from a car hitch. But her survival results in America not joining World War II against the Nazis, and therefore also has massive historical ramifications going far forward into the future. So basically, in order to reset that, he has to go back to that point where he rescued her and choose not to and basically let her die. Saying that a good person needs to die and that the greater good is going to have people die anyway is pretty damn depressing, I think. And I think Miriel would be that kind of situation. You would think that the only things that would be really affected at this point, and kind of makes sense, would be anything to do with the Noldor and Feanor in this particular fantasy butterfly effect. But I think in reality, it's much, much further. I'm not going to go as far as to say that it was fated for Miriel to die, and thus kickstart the main timeline events, because though I don't know how, free will is just as tied into the fabric of Middle-earth as the idea of fate, whatever that is maybe. But at the very least, I can say it's almost heavily implied. That being said, what are your thoughts? Do you think that Miriel would have had such a massive ramification going forward into the future if she had chosen to live? Do you think that things would have remained the same and that Feanor still would have been a jerk and everything would have happened the way the main timeline would have happened? Let me know in the comments below. But otherwise, this is the Middle-earth Philosopher, and y'all have a good day.